All right, everybody, welcome. We're just going to request that you turn off your cameras and microphone, and please note that this event is being recorded. I just want to invite Chairman Lopez to open our event today.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our 21st, 22nd, 23rd Mutsun Speaker Series. We're very proud of that longevity that we've had here with this series. It started in 2009, and it's gone without fail twice a year. We're excited about this year's Mutsun Speaker Series event. About a year and a half ago, University of California Office of the President, Janet Napolitano, awarded a $1 million grant to 4 universities, well, to the UC system actually, but it's being managed by 4 universities. They are UCLA, UC Riverside, UC San Diego, and UC Santa Cruz. The purpose of those grants was to fund research and education projects, to retell the mission story, to tell that story truthfully. They recognized that the story that was being told of the California mission system was far from the truth. There was a lot of a momentum that was building up to being known that the story of the missions was incorrectly told. And a big impetus to that was the book, A Cross of Thorns by Elias Castillo, who was once a Mutsun Speaker Series speaker himself. And so we are very glad to see that grant being made to tell the truth. At UC Santa Cruz, I've been working very closely with the faculty there, the Native faculty, and others to take full advantage of this opportunity to retell that story. And today's Mutsun Speaker Series event is going to present some of that. And you will see some research is being shared for the very first time. I'm not going to go over all of the speakers. I'll have them be introduced by the students. But I do want to thank them all for being here. Thank you for your work. We believe that we're making a huge difference in having that story told. And telling that story is important because it brings healing and it brings wellness to all Indigenous people to finally have those important truths be told. It also helps us better understand our identities, to better understand our tribal identities and our histories in a much more truthful way. I referenced the book earlier, and that was a book called A Cross of Thorns. And that right there was written by Elias Castillo, who spent 7 years researching, mostly in Mexico City, in the archives of Mexico City and the mission archives, on what mission life was actually like. And he studied the letters and the transcripts and the journals and stuff of the priests. And it tells a brutal story. It tells a horrific story. And it does not tell the story that the missions want to be told about that history. And so we can get started today now with today's speaker series. I'm looking forward to it. But as I said, today you're going to hear a lot of those stories. You're going to hear a lot of those truths for the first time. So thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Lopez, for your words. We're honored to have you with us today. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tani Henningsen, and I'm an intern for the American Indian Resource Center. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm Concal Maidu from Orville, California. As a California native myself, I'm so excited to be here with the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band today and presenting these incredible speakers. The AIRC is dedicated to supporting the needs of American Indian students at UC Santa Cruz. It is one of 6 resource centers on campus. The AIRC is also home of the People of Color Sustainability Collective. Throughout the year, we host workshops and presentations that raise awareness about issues that pertain to Indigenous people. We have been hosting the Amah Mutsun Speaker Series for many years now, and this is our first time holding it virtually. We ask for your patience as we move through the event today, and thank you all for being with us. Today, my fellow AIRC interns, Areli Hernandez, Kimiko Hassler, and Andrea Lopez will introduce our extraordinary speakers. Take it away, Areli.
Thank you, Tani. Hello, everyone. My name is Areli Hernandez. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am Maya Mam from Guatemala and Otomi from Mexico. I'm very excited to introduce our first presentation from our very own UCSC family, Dr. Renya Ramirez, Dr. Judith Scott, and Dr. Daisy Martin. Dr. Renya Ramirez is a Ho-Chuk and Ojibwe professor at UCSC Anthropology Department. Dr. Judith Scott is Tsalagi, also known as Cherokee, and a professor at the UCSC Education Department. Dr. Martin is the director of the History and Civics project at UCSC, and together they'll be speaking on incorporating Indigenous perspectives and facilitating change in K-12 classrooms.
Okay, so I guess we'll get started. Welcome, everyone, and let me share my screen because we have a PowerPoint presentation that we'd like to share with you. Did that come up? I love technology, especially on a Saturday morning. Okay, here we go. Okay, so our talk today is about facilitating change in the K-12 classrooms. And thank you, Areli, for that great introduction. I'm just going to start going through the slides. Oh, actually, maybe I should let Renya and Daisy just show their faces before we get started. So, Renya, are you there? Okay, and Daisy. All right, so the 3 of us have collaborated on creating this presentation, and our entire project is a collaboration. As Val mentioned, it's funded through the Critical Mission Studies Project. That's a multi-campus research program initiative through the UC Office of the President. And as we are doing this work, we are working very closely with the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, and we are also working very closely with the History and Civics Project. And some of you may recognize the people that are on our steering committee, and I know that many of you are in the audience. All right, so our goal for this project is to develop resources that elementary teachers can use that will emphasize Indigenous perspectives. And in so, what we want to do is to challenge the dominant colonial narrative and the current practice in teaching about the missions and the mission era in elementary schools. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Daisy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Judy, and thank you to all the organizers and presenters. So here we're looking at a picture taken Friday, June 21st, 2019, when we are seeing the mission bell on UC Santa Cruz campus being removed, thanks to the efforts of Chairman Lopez and others. And on this day, Chairman Lopez reiterated some of how he opened today to the press. He said, quote, "These bells are deeply painful symbols that celebrate the destruction, domination, and erasure of our people. He continued on to say, they are constant reminders that our people and our history continue to be disregarded to this day. The true history of the California mission system has never been told. And I end quote there from Chairman Lopez. So we're here today not to talk about necessarily public memorials that celebrate a colonial past and whitewash and distort this past. We're going to center our look at like what's happening in classrooms. So the next image that we have shows something that is familiar to many of you. It's the Mission Project that has been a staple in California elementary classrooms for years. It still looms large. So in a time when little history, unfortunately, is taught in elementary school classrooms, we still have a lot of mission projects happening. So there are issues and problems with this mission project, which again, many of you are familiar with. So here is scholar Harper Keenan saying one problem with how the mission era is currently taught is that school curriculum typically serves to replenish the idea that colonizers and their descendants are entitled to land by controlling or erasing indigenous knowledge. And here is Deb Miranda from her book, Bad Indians, saying, the mission unit is all too often a lesson in imperialism, racism, and manifest destiny rather than actually educational or a jumping off point for critical thinking or accurate history. So there are multiple issues with how the mission era is too commonly taught. I'm going to start with the focus is on architecture and buildings. So this historical encounter and interaction becomes a focus on a building, absent people. When the people are included, the indigenous perspective and experience is absent or whitewashed. The narrative that it's embedded within is a settler colonial one, and it's sanitized and inaccurate. The violence is gone. The narrative focuses on just the mission period, the natives in the mission, if that at all, leaving out all the natives who are also in California who were not part of the system. So it's not only sanitized, inaccurate, overly narrow, etc., and promoting colonial narratives, which do harm. Here's a quote from one of our folks we worked with last spring, who is both a teacher in training and a mom who recounts this problem with the missions. I remember the first time I learned the truth about California missions. I was a 25-year-old community college student, and one of my professors assigned the book Bad Indians. I was shocked that I'd grown up in Santa Cruz County and never learned these truths. At this time, I also had a 4th grade foster son in my care. I can remember sitting on my couch reading Bad Indians while my husband was at the table helping our foster son construct a mission model out of popsicle sticks. That felt like a betrayal. And that's from Lonnie Alameda. So what we hope to do is teachers who are anxious and ready to replace this sort of long-standing curriculum it's hard to find replacement materials. Even while some folks have been working on it, and these are some websites that have some materials, but what we aim to do is to support teachers in replacing the outdated and inaccurate and harmful narrative that is promoted by the Mission Project. And so we're doing multiple things. We want to center the voices of the Amah Mutsun and indigenous perspectives in this curriculum. And we also want to recenter we also want to make sure that we center place as important to understanding these narratives. Sometimes place is lost. It becomes just a building rather than a landscape. We want to support a community of teachers in transforming the way the mission is taught. Many teachers are interested in abandoning the outdated colonial narrative. And so we want to support them in doing that. Dislodge the settler colonialism frame embedded in most curriculum, and actually replace the mission project with more accurate, more healing, more place-based narratives, resources, and sources. And so now I'll turn it over to you, Renya.
Hi, Renya Ramirez. I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be supporting the Amah Mutsun and the Indigenous people of the area. So what we're doing is we are collecting past and present oral histories. We're working with undergraduates at UC Santa Cruz. We're writing grade appropriate fiction with historically accurate endnotes. And we're creating sample curriculum and piloting it with teachers. So what we've done so far, we've collected or obtained 52 pages of excerpts from the Harrington Notes that reference the missions. And we did this with the permission and in collaboration with the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, who provided us these Harrington Notes. Harrington was a linguist who did interviews of Amah Mutsun ancestors. And so we're working in close collaboration with the Amah Mutsun. We'll only use material that they agree that we can use. We've hired 2 Amah Mutsun Tribal Band graduate students, including Carolyn Rodriguez, who was an undergrad here at UC Santa Cruz, and she's now at UCLA in Ph.D. in education. And we're also working with Alexi Sagona, who is a PhD student at UC Berkeley. And they're the ones who are conducting oral history interviews with up to 14 Amah Mutsun tribal members. So we'll be using this material to help us develop Amah Mutsun perspectives of the 4th grade curriculum and Indigenous perspectives overall. What we've also done so far is we've worked with 8 undergraduates here at UC Santa Cruz. We conducted a group independent studies course in the spring of last year, actually this year. We helped them learn about the project, to explore resources and conduct their own interviews. So some of the things that they did was they explored maps as teaching tools. They reviewed textbook and digital teaching materials. They interviewed parents, teachers, administrators, and park personnel at the Santa Cruz mission. So here's just an example of a map that a student found and collected. And it's a late 1700s map of the colonizers, the French, the Spanish, and the British. And the purpose of collecting this map is to teach these 4th graders about how geography can be inherently colonial and encourage them to develop a critical perspective. A student also found this map. This map was in Martin Rizzo's dissertation that he wrote. about the Santa Cruz mission, and he worked with the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band to develop this map. And so this is a very different representation from an Indigenous perspective of the local area, which highlights the Awaswas, the Mutsun, the Rumsen, the Esalen, all these different Indigenous people who lived here prior to colonization. So the purpose of collecting these maps is that way fourth graders can start realizing that they're completely surrounded with these colonial perspectives that these maps represent. This is another example of what a student did as part of this course that we taught. The student did a survey and asked questions of parents. This question: I believe my child has been presented an accurate account of the mission period. And this is how the parents responded. And so you can see that we have a lot of work to do, because we had 2 parents who strongly agreed with this statement, 6 parents who agreed with this statement, and then 8 parents who were neutral. So there weren't as many people or parents who realized that there's a real problem with the representation of the history of the mission period in California. And now I will hand it off to Judith Scott.
Okay, so one of the things that we want to share with you today is the fact that it's not just textbooks that are problematic in elementary schools. There's also a lack of diversity of all kinds of books. And this is a graphic from the Cooperative Children's Book Center. And it shows that in 2018, 50% of the books that were written that were children's books had a white protagonist, and 27% had either an animal or something else. And the rest of the population were represented by less than 25% of the books that were published that year. So if you look at this year, and if I can find this, out of 3,716 children's books that were published in 2019, only 28 were written by Native American or First Nations authors, and 44 were written about Native Americans or First Nations people. So that's a big problem for all people of color. So one of the things that we've done so far is we've begun to write some fictional stories that provide an alternative perspective about the mission era. And then they're written as short stories, and we're going to include historically accurate endnotes after the story to sort of tell what we know about that period. So I started writing one.
It looks like Judy, we've lost her. So I'm going to go ahead and continue. This is something that Judy wrote. The animals thought about what to do. Finally, Renya said, this is an Amah Mutsun name, I know that I'm small, but I'm persistent.
I will pull up that slide.
This is what happens with technology.
Yeah, just 1 second.
Okay, I'll keep going unless Judy joins us. Finally, Rena said, I know I'm small, but I'm persistent. I'm going to gnaw the ropes that pull the bells that should stop them from ringing. For 7 days and 7 nights, she gnawed on rope pulls until finally, with one last bite, the rope slid down from the tower and onto the ground. The next morning, there was no way to ring the bell, and the animals cheered the silence. No clanging, no bells. They could hear the ocean and the wind blowing through the trees. They rejoiced, congratulated Rena, and went back home. In the meantime, the priests wove old blankets into a makeshift rope. But the next week, Rena's sister climbed the bell tower and gnawed through that too. The priests made the Amah Mutsun women weave new ropes, but the Amah Mutsun hated the bells as much as the animals. They created weak spots in the ropes to help the mice destroy them. Every time a new rope was attached, another mouse climbed into the bell tower and started gnawing. So the next steps that we need to do is, as part of our project is to work with teacher volunteers to plan and pilot material to change the curriculum. We need to continue to develop a website with resources for teachers. We'll be providing professional development sessions along with Amah Mutsun Tribal Band members targeting educators and park personnel. And these are our final thoughts. We're trying to change the way history is presented in schools. In particular, this work provides a unique opportunity to transform the curriculum used in 4th grade classrooms. If you're interested in volunteering as a teacher, illustrator, or web designer, please contact us, Judy, Renya, or Daisy. So thank you. We're now, I'm glad Judy's back to join us, and now we're open for Q&A. Thank you for your patience.
Sorry about that. I got bumped off right in the middle of my story.
You did. We're glad you're back.
Glad you're back, Judy.
And thank you guys for jumping in. Okay. So is somebody going to direct questions to us?
Great. Thank you so much, you three. We'll now have the brief Q&A session. We have about 4 or 5 minutes, not too much time. For everyone who's on the Zoom call, you may send your questions through chat to ask your questions here. And Julia and myself will be reading our questions aloud for the speakers. And my name is Chris Lang. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the graduate student intern for the People of Color Sustainability Collective.
Hi everyone, my name is Julia Gavin and I use she, her pronouns. I am Danae and Blackfeet and a second-year intern here at the AIRC.
So we'll have the first question right here. It asks, I'm curious if there is work being done on how to integrate Indigenous perspectives and histories into curricula for other grades. I know 4th grade does emphasize the mission period and that period in history, but I'm curious if other grades curricula are being looked into for revision as well.
Well, I could say something quickly about that. Yes, the answer is our focus is the 4th grade, but even while we do that, there's multiple places across K-12 where restoring more accurate narratives and Indigenous perspectives is important. So I'll give you one example. There is another site, Protect Eurostock, which is overseen by the Amah Mutsun tribe, has resources for secondary teachers, some posted, and a regional teacher has taken those and is teaching doing a whole different US history course. So there is work being done, but yeah, the short answer is yes, but this project focuses on the 4th grade.
But we're on our website, we'll be having resources, as many as we can find for as many grades as possible too. So once we get the website up and running.
Thank you, Dr. Martin and Scott. So if the speakers feel comfortable, could they share their own experiences with mission education?
Sure. I grew up in California, and I remember vividly coming home one day and reading something about the Native people. And I was in tears because it was, they told things that my family had not told me. And I remember going up to my dad and saying, look, it's in the textbook. This is what they're saying. And he, said, just because it's in the textbook doesn't mean it's true. And he wrote down, and I had, I was a very argumentative young child. And so I had this argument with him about how textbooks were right and he was wrong. And then he finally pulled out a pen and he wrote down, the words like the moon is made of, green cheese or something like that. And he said, I wrote it down. Does that make it true? And that's just a lesson that stuck with me for a really long time. Just because somebody wrote it down doesn't make it true.
I also grew up in California, and my mother was always taught me the Native perspective of history. And so when I heard about the California missions, I knew it was wrong. And so I remember feeling very angry about it. And I also felt angry about having to build a mission, because it felt like kind of building something like if you were Jewish and you would build this crematorium or something. So for me, it was very painful to have to do the mission project because my mother had told me the Indigenous perspective of the California missions already.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. We have time for one last question. And this question is, what challenges have you faced trying to translate ethnographic notes into digestible K-12 educational materials?
That's a real hard one, because the ethnographic notes are sometimes telling a real hard history. And, so we're struggling with that, trying to figure out how to make it, something that will work in schools. And yet the history needs to be told. Daisy, do you want to add to that?
I would say, and we're sort of just starting the process. So we anticipate some of these, like the issue that Judy brought up, but I also think that starting with what is existing helps, and what, because there are so many myths floating around. And so in some ways, some of what we want to do is use those archival materials to actually directly counter those myths. And Chairman Lopez mentioned the Cross of Thorns book, which even just one of our students took just a short excerpt from that, talking about how, let's talk about the Indigenous folks before the missions. Let's talk about the Indigenous folks outside the missions. So short pieces can actually counter myths and make students start to go, wait, get the same lesson that Judy got from her dad, which is like, just because the textbook says it it's just one account. It doesn't mean that it's the final truth. And in fact, I need to interrogate this textbook. So I anticipate more topics, or that's a great question, but we do start with how students think, start with how classrooms work, and that helps inform, it will help inform some of that source selection.
Thank you, Dr. Martin, Dr. Scott, and Dr. Ramirez for sharing your insights with us today. We will now move on to our next speaker of this series, Dr. Rob Cuthrell.
Thank you, Dr. Renya Ramirez, Dr. Judith Scott, and Dr. Daisy Martin for that wonderful presentation. My name is Kimiko Hostler. I am a second-year intern with the AIRC. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe. I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Rob Cuthrell, the Director of the Archaeological Resource Management for the Amah Mutsun Land Trust. Today, Dr. Cuthrell will be sharing his work on revitalizing Amah Mutsun community narratives for all Indigenous history of Mission San Juan Bautista.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction. And thanks very much to the American Indian Resource Center at UC Santa Cruz for inviting me to talk today. And thanks to the Critical Mission Studies program at UC for supporting this work. So today I'm going to be talking about a Critical Mission Studies project. That's a collaboration between Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, Amah Mutsun Land Trust, and researchers who are Ph.D. students at UC Berkeley, UCLA, and we're also working with folks at UC Santa Cruz. And I'll be focusing today on the community narratives that were collected in the 1920s and 30s that are supporting this Critical Mission Studies project, specifically focusing on Mission San Juan Bautista and the history of Amah Mutsun Tribal Band people at Mission San Juan Bautista. So some of the other speakers have talked about today. We can look back at the history of writing about the California missions, and we see that a lot of the early histories are what I'm calling conventional or romantic histories of the California missions. So to simplify, these histories written in the late 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of them were coming from the perspective of Catholic priests and as well as academics and scholars who subscribed to the dominant colonialist ideology and racist ideologies that were prevalent at the time. And these histories presented the missions as benevolent enterprises. They, are places that were established for the good of Native people to quote unquote civilize Native tribes and convert them from their pagan religions into Catholicism. And these were the narratives that a lot of people who are older today grew up with and who were taught in school as well, as we've heard from the previous speaker. And then more recently, really just in the last 30 or 40 years, there have been more critical approaches to mission history that look back at the mission records and the accounts of people outside of the Spanish colonial system who visited the missions and are reinterpreting the missions in a truer fashion, seeing the missions as a tool of the Spanish colonial empire, where the intent was clearly to acculturate Native people, to turn them from their traditional way of life in which they stewarded and took care of the lands in which they lived into agricultural peasant labor and craft labor that was going to support the expansion of the Spanish Empire. And so these are institutions that were supporting enslavement of Native people, and that resulted in the genocide of Native culture and many Native tribes. And so here I've got some examples of some of these critical histories. The Missions of California, A Legacy of Genocide by Rupert Costa and Jeanette Henry Costa. Cross of Thorns, which Valentin Lopez mentioned earlier, by Elias Castilla, and Indians, Missionaries, and Merchants by Professor Kent Lightfoot, who's also an advisor on the project that we're working on. So what was life like for Native people in the missions? Just to give sort of a general sense, in the early mission period, the Spanish missions and the priests would coerce Native people into joining the missions by giving them gifts. They would offer them positions of power in the social hierarchy within the mission system. They would give them exotic goods that they couldn't get anywhere else, that gave them prestige outside of the mission and within the mission. But as time went on, they went past coercion, and especially as you get toward the end of the mission period in the 1820s and 30s, you start to hear stories about Native people being kidnapped outright by soldiers. We have stories from Mission San Juan Bautista of expeditions sent out into the Central Valley where the soldiers would ambush settlements of Native people, kidnap them, and then forcibly march them back into the missions. So it's pretty brutal how people were brought into the missions in the later period. And then regardless of how people were brought into the missions, once they were in the missions, they couldn't get back out. Once they were baptized, they were considered more or less the property of the mission. It was fair to say that it was a form of enslavement. They were forced to carry out agricultural labor and to produce craft goods for sale to support the missions and then support the Spanish Empire. Unmarried men and women in the missions were imprisoned every night in dormitories or nunneries, as they were called. And these were not good living conditions. Dozens of people would be crammed into small rooms and they would be stuck side by side in really unsanitary conditions every night. If people tried to run away from the missions or if they fled, they would be recaptured. If they didn't obey the orders to do the work, they would be tortured. Usually people would be tortured through whipping, but also imprisonment and public humiliation. And if people committed what were considered criminal offenses and were imprisoned in the Spanish presidios, it was usually more or less a death sentence because the conditions in the presidios were so poor, the sanitary conditions were so poor, and people would continue to be tortured while they were in the presidios that few people who went into there made it out. So I think of the Spanish missions in California as being concentration camps. They're places where Native tribes were brought in and their cultures and their people were systematically destroyed. And so what we're trying to do with this project is revitalize dormant knowledge, dormant Native knowledge about the history of tribes in the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band traditional territory in the missions. So what is dormant knowledge? It's knowledge that isn't necessarily socially active within a community today, but it can be recovered, it can be revived, it's not completely lost. And so some examples of dormant knowledge would be oral narratives that might be remembered by one or just a few people, information that is in documentary archives but hasn't ever been published and isn't easily accessible, inferences that it's made through critical historical research. So a great example of that would be the work that Dr. Martin Rizzo has done, looking at the relationships between Native people in the baptismal records and marriage and death records in the missions and making inferences about relationships between tribal communities through that type of research. And then finally, another source is information from archaeological research on the physical materials that people leave behind from their day-to-day living. And I have to mention archaeological research because that's my own background. So specifically, we're looking to revitalize dormant knowledge that's coming from the perspective of Native people at the missions. And as you can imagine, there are few examples of these in the documentary histories. Native people, typically were not literate at the time. They weren't writing about themselves, and the priests typically were not very interested in writing about them. And so a lot of the stories have been lost. But both at Mission Santa Cruz and at San Juan Bautista, we do have some examples of Native perspective. So at Mission Santa Cruz, we have interviews from Lorenzo Asesara, a Native man who was raised in Mission Santa Cruz and gave interviews in the late 1800s, which Martin Rizzo talks about in his dissertation, Nos Somos Animales. But today we'll be focusing more on Mission San Juan Bautista, and there we have a wealth of oral narratives that were passed down from the mission times into the 1920s and 30s, and then recorded by the community in collaboration with an ethnologist, John P. Harrington. So the previous speakers talked about the Harrington Notes. Just to go into a little more detail on that, John Harrington was a Smithsonian ethnologist. He worked with many tribes on the west coast of North America. His main interest was linguistics, but he was also interested in history and cultural practices. And throughout the course of his career, he put together over 750,000 pages of material, which are now archived in the Smithsonian Institution. And this includes about 75,000 pages of material that was collected in association with tribes in the San Francisco Bay Area, mainly working with Mutsun and Rumsen people, as well as Chochenyo people who were associated with the East San Francisco Bay Area. And he worked closely with the Amah Mutsun community between 1929 and 1935. And the person we hear about most from the Amah Mutsun community at this time is a very important cultural leader, Ascension Solorzano. And she was the main person who provided information from Amah Mutsun Tribal Band to John Harrington. And here's some pictures of her throughout her life. So Ascension was a tribal leader, a healer, a doctor, and a culture bearer. And so was her mother, Barbara. Her mother, Barbara, was born and baptized into Mission San Juan Bautista, and she passed along a lot of her knowledge to Ascension. Ascension also learned from other tribal elders when she was a young girl growing up. Ascension was born around 1855, and she died in 1930. And so in the previous slide, I said, John Harrington was working with the tribe mainly starting in 1929. And so he was working with Ascension in the months leading up to her death. And I think what was happening is, he had visited her once in 1922, and then he left after working with her briefly and worked with other groups. And then he came back to Amah Mutsun in 1929 and realized that both Ascension and Harrington knew that she wasn't going to live much longer. She was sick with cancer. And so they spent the last few months of her life working together very intensively to record as much information as possible while she was still able to. But then after Ascension's death, Harrington didn't disappear. He continued to work very closely with the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band community in the area, and especially with members of Ascension's family. And what developed after Ascension's death was what we could call, I think, a collaborative research project, where the records that we have today in the Harrington Notes collection are not just what Harrington wrote down, but it's a work that was produced by Amah Mutsun Tribal Band community members working with John Harrington. And I would say the community members from the tribe put at least as much work into this as Harrington himself did. So that's what I want to talk about next. So this is a great photograph. And I also want to say that all of these photographs are also part of the Harrington Notes collection. And it consists of about 200 photographs of the people who Harrington was working with and some of the places that he worked. And so this photograph is showing Ascension with some of her family members. And just about every one of these people worked together with John Harrington after Ascension's death. And so this is showing in red the relationship between each of these people and Ascension. So these are close members of her family as well as her extended family. And then here are some other members of the family who worked closely with John Harrington, Ascension's daughters and her sister-in-law, Antonia Sanchez. And there were two Amah Mutsun tribe members who worked very closely with John Harrington. On the left is Marta Herrera, Ascension's granddaughter. And Marta became a research assistant with John Harrington. The way that this worked is, Harrington was working very frantically with Ascension for several months leading up to her death. And then he went back to Washington, D.C. And he was then working on turning those brief notes, the field notes that he had written down, into narrative texts for publication. But he would have a lot of questions that would need to be clarified about what he had written down. And so he would correspond with Marta, who was still living with the community, and ask Marta to, go out and ask the other community members to clarify the questions that he had. And so Marta was his research assistant, and as well as a transcriptionist. At one point, John Harrington bought her a typewriter so that she could type up the notes that he would send her. And she has a very extensive correspondence with John Harrington. So that's Marta on the left. And then on the right is Henry Cervantes. And Henry Cervantes is a grandson of Ascension Solorzano. And my understanding is that Henry actually went back with John Harrington to Washington, D.C., and was working with him to help organize and edit the notes that he collected from the tribe. And so Henry was also a research assistant as well as a fieldwork assistant. When John Harrington was doing fieldwork with the tribe, Henry would drive him around from place to place. And Henry was also a translator who would take the texts that, the narrative accounts that John Harrington would produce, and he would translate them into Californio Spanish phonetically. And he would also work with Harrington to edit the notes that they were collecting. And so back in 2014, we set up this project called the Amah Mutsun Harrington Notes Transcription Project. And this was a collaborative effort between the tribal band, Amah Mutsun Land Trust, and UC Berkeley, funded by the Research Institute of Humanity and Nature in Kyoto, Japan. Our goal was to digitize the narrative portions of the content from the Harrington Notes and to make this information available to tribe members. So a lot of the Harrington Notes are linguistic information. So a page of the notes might just contain a little bit of grammar and some notes about the use of language. But another part of the Harrington Notes is called the San Juan Report. And these are the ethnographic materials that John Harrington was working on preparing for publication, and that he was working together with Marta and Henry and the other tribe members to make as accurate as possible and to turn into easily understandable stories. And so these are archived in the form of, in the Smithsonian, in the forms of PDF versions of microfilm that we are then processing through this multi-step process outlined at the bottom. So the first step is transcription, which is making a literal copy, typing the text from the microfilm into the database, translating and proofreading the material, and then finally formatting and interpreting it. So turning it into something that is easy for somebody who's not familiar with the conventions of Harrington's recording. It makes it easy for them to understand. And so here's an example of what this looks like. This is information that was provided by a Roomson woman named Isabel Meadows to John Harrington. So this is John Harrington's handwriting. This is a relatively clean version of his handwriting. His writing ranges from fairly legible to totally illegible, depending on how fast he was going. So up at the top, the highlighted part, here's an example of how that would be transcribed. It says in period, in details about making the needles, but would not have been blessed by a priest, for the priest would say, dame la mitad. So when you're working with this and then going on to translate it and format it, you have to know what in period means. And what that means is it's an abbreviation for the Latin word nescit, which means does not know. So you have to sort of have this context to understand all of these abbreviations and shortcuts that Harrington used when he was taking notes. And so going on from the transcription, here's a version of what this text would look like once it's been translated, formatted, and interpreted. So it might go like, the informant does not know the details about making the divining needles, but they would not have them blessed by a priest, for the priest would say, give me half of the treasure that you would find with the divining needles. The informant then goes on to tell about a head of gold near the mouth of the Carmel River, where men took Alfonso and the needles pointed down by the door of the house, but the people living there would not give permission to dig under the house. But Alfonso thinks it was excavated afterward. So it can be quite an effort to translate and format some of these materials. And so, you know, I mentioned earlier how there was a lot of correspondence between Harrington and Marta to clarify parts of the Harrington Notes, and this is an example of that. And, you know, I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but up at the top, we have Harrington, you know, writing out some questions for Marta to answer, and we can see some examples of his idiosyncratic use of punctuation. He really liked to put long strings of question marks and other punctuation in his letters. And another thing to note is that at the end of his typed text, you can see he's signed it JPH and HJC. So that's John P. Harrington and Henry J. Cervantes, because they were working together in Washington, D.C. So he writes to ask Marta some questions. Marta writes him a response in her beautiful cursive handwriting. And then later on in 1935, Harrington is reading this information at the top to Isabel Meadows, a Roomson woman, and then making notes about what Isabel Meadows had to say about this, this passage. So this is what working with the Harrington Notes is like. So during this time from 2014 to 2017, we were able to transcribe about 12,000 out of the 75,000 pages of text, including all of the narrative content that was associated with the San Juan Report and other documents about Native history and culture. About 2,500 of those pages have been translated and edited in some way, and about 1,000 have been cleanly formatted, which amounts to about 450 pages of sort of single-spaced typed text. And out of that, as the previous speakers mentioned, we have about 50 pages of typed text that are related to Mission San Juan Bautista. And these are stories that range from the type of clothing that people wore in the mission to the type of foods that they ate, to stories about, you know, as I mentioned earlier, how the soldiers would go out and force people living in the Central Valley into the missions. There are stories about the mistreatment that Native people suffered in the missions, about the diseases that came through and wiped out entire tribes in the missions. And down at the bottom, I just wanted to acknowledge the people who worked so hard on this project, including the members of the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, as well as over a dozen UC Berkeley students and volunteers from Amah Mutsun Land Trust. So another part of this project from 2014 to 2017 was the development of the Mutsun Ways Tribal Periodical. And this is our venue for presenting the information from the Harrington Notes to the tribe. So what Mutsun Ways is it's a publication that's just for tribe members, because the tribe considers a great deal of this information to be confidential or sensitive, and it's not necessarily appropriate to share it with members of the public. And so we published 4 issues of this periodical, Mutsun Ways. Each one had a different theme. And here's an example of the title page with some of the table of contents from the first issue that we did, which was about food and cooking. And this one was about Native foods as well as foods from the mission times. So that brings us to where we are now with the UC Critical Mission Studies project. So Amah Mutsun Tribal Band through Amah Mutsun Land Trust applied for a community-initiated partnership grant titled Speaking Ancestral Truth, Amah Mutsun Tribal History at Mission San Juan Bautista and Mission Santa Cruz. And the goal of this project is to share the tribe's perspectives on Native history at the missions with members of the public who go to the state historic parks and visit the missions. And also, we're working to revitalize the dormant knowledge from archival sources, as well as from the Harrington Notes that we've been working on, and make this information active again within the tribal community, as well as among members of the public as the tribe determines to be appropriate. So what we've been working on is first, reviewing the literature and conducting research and archival work to identify and synthesize information about Mission San Juan Bautista and Mission Santa Cruz. And what we're going to do with this is produce booklets that'll be authored by the tribe and reviewed and vetted by the tribal leadership about Native history at each of the missions. And these will be 20 to 30 page long booklets that'll be distributed at the State Parks Visitor Center. We also want to publish another issue of Mutsun Ways with information from the Harrington Notes about Mission San Juan Bautista, and have a tribal gathering to share the information both from the booklets and from the Harrington Notes with the tribe. So those of us who are working on this project is the tribal chair, Valentin Lopez, the vice chair and tribal historian, Ed Ketchum, myself, and then Alexi Sagona, Ph.D. student in environmental science, policy and management at Berkeley, and Carolyn Rodriguez, a Ph.D. student in social research methodology at UCLA. And so where we are right now, the project has been delayed a bit because of COVID-19. The access to our main research archive, the Bancroft Library, was restricted starting in March, and we've only recently been able to access that archive again. But we're hoping to complete the research phase of the project by the end of this month and start drafting material for these booklets. For the Mission Santa Cruz booklet, our main source of information is going to be the excellent work that Dr. Martin Rizzo has done and written in his dissertation, No Somos Animales, or We Are Not Animals. And for Mission San Juan Bautista, the information sources will be the Harrington Notes, previous publications, and tribal archives. So we're hoping that the booklet material is going to be drafted in the next few months. It'll be reviewed by the tribal leadership and hopefully finalized in early 2021. And then the tribal gathering to share the information with the tribe will be presented after that. And many thanks once again to the Critical Mission Studies program for supporting this work, the AIRC staff for organizing this excellent event, and for all of the folks who are advising and consulting with us on this project. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Cuthrell. We're gonna start with the question and answer session again. As a reminder, you may send your questions through the chat to ask your questions here. And the first one that we have received is, can you recommend a good book or two for folks who are new to the topic of the missions in California?
Yeah, I'd recommend the books that I highlighted a bit earlier in my talk. So Indians, Missionaries, and Merchants by Kent Lightfoot gives a general overview of the early colonial period in California, both in terms of the Spanish missions, as well as the Russian colonialism in California. And it contrasts those two systems, where the Spanish missions were focused very heavily on acculturation and converting people into this European peasant lifestyle, while the Russians were really more mercantile and focused on economic relationships with Native people. So that's a good general overview. And then more specifically about the experiences of Native people in the missions, look at A Cross of Thorns by Elias Castillo and the California Missions, A Legacy of Genocide by the Costos.
Thank you for those recommendations. We have another question. Was it unusual for women to be included in interviews like this at the time?
So if we're thinking about the ethno-historic work that John Harrington was doing, women provided the overwhelming majority of the information that he collected from Mutsun and Rumsen tribe members. Ascension Solorzano, like I mentioned, was his main source of information for the Mutsun tribe. And Isabel Meadows was his main source of information for Rumsen people. And Marta Herrera, as well as Claudia Corona, Antonia Sanchez, Alberta Sanchez, and Dionysia Mondragon, all of Ascension's daughters and granddaughters, I think those were the people who she mainly passed down her knowledge to. And so when Harrington was following up after his fieldwork to clarify the questions that he had, those were the people who were the main information sources. They were the ones who Ascension had passed along not only her knowledge about the tribe's history, but also about the medicinal practices. You know, the women, it seems like they tended to be the healers and the doctors within the tribe. So I would say by far and away, they were the ones who worked most closely with Harrington.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Cuthrell. We have one, I think, time for one last question. So you mentioned John Harrington's extensive notes on experiences from Mission San Juan Bautista. Someone was curious, how was he initially received by the tribal communities when conducting his ethnographic fieldwork there in the mission? And is there any insight into his motives for doing this work?
Yeah, I really can't talk about how the community perceived him at the beginning, because I believe that he was first introduced to them in 1922 when he was working with Ascension very briefly. And I don't know what their first impressions of him were like, because we don't have information from their perspective at that time. But what I can say is that as time went on and as he worked with them in the 1920s, the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, I think that he did establish a very close relationship with some of the tribe members and a relationship of trust and friendship. And you get the sense of this by reading the letters that they're sending back and forth. A lot of times, you know, they won't be super you know, professional in their language. They're much more colloquial, and you know, they'll reference, you know, Harrington will reference things that people did together. Whenever Harrington was doing work in the area, whenever he was traveling around the, you know, Monterey Bay area, even after Ascension's death, he would live with Dionysia Mondragon, Ascension's daughter. And you know, he spent just a huge amount of time working with Henry Cervantes. So I do think that he established a close relationship with the tribe. And I don't think that they would have shared some of the information that they shared with him if they had not had a relationship of trust with him. And when it comes to his motives, it's hard to say, but you know, I do get the sense that John Harrington was very passionate about preserving native language, especially. He was never very good at finishing projects and publishing them. A lot of academics are motivated primarily by publishing because that's how you gain recognition within the academic community. But John Harrington, he never took the time really to publish what he had worked on, and he would always collect the information, and then before he would publish it, he would find some other case where, you know, there was a language that might be disappearing, where the last few speakers of that language were at the end of their lives, and instead of, you know, spending his time publishing material, he would go work with the next community. And so I think he was very passionate about preserving the knowledge of Native people, and I think that Ascension and some of the other tribe members understood that. So thanks very much again for this wonderful event.
Thank you, Dr. Rob Cuthrell, for your presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Lopez. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a first-year student here at UC Santa Cruz, and my tribal affiliation is Lakota. I'm honored to introduce our final speaker today, Dr. Martin Rizzo, who is the California State Park Historian for the Santa Cruz District. Dr. Martin Rizzo will be sharing information from his forthcoming book. His presentation is titled, "We Are Not Animals, Indigenous History for Santa Cruz County."
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, to be one of these speakers, and it's great to be a part of all this. I've really enjoyed the other two presentations as well. I want to start by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from my home here in the town of Soquel, which is in the traditional homelands of the Aptos people, who are the ancestral relatives of the Amah Mutsun. I just want to start by acknowledging that. And I'm here to talk to you today about some of the research that I've done for my forthcoming book, which will be in print in the fall of 2021. And my book and my research examines the history of Native people of the Santa Cruz region. And thank you, Rob, mentioned my dissertation earlier. My book is basically a much better revised version of the dissertation, where I've added new chapters and new research, and especially worked very closely with Amah Mutsun tribal historian Ed Ketchum. So I'm including some of Ed's stories and some oral histories in that as well. Among the many problems with telling the mission stories the way that they have been told up to this point is typically from the perspectives of the Franciscan missionaries. And of course, along with this comes an erasure of indigenous histories and stories. Hold on a second, I'm going to share my screen with you, if you bear with me. Let me put this in presentation mode. By focusing on Franciscan missionaries as kind of the center of the mission story, it's been an erasure of indigenous histories and stories. When we focus exclusively on these perspectives, we lose all of these rich histories that, of course, are still here and exist. And these rich and complicated stories of Native people before and after the missions are still out there to be found. Research can be done despite this erasure. And my book focuses on illuminating these histories and the politics of indigenous tribes and families and individuals who navigated Mission Santa Cruz and the whole Santa Cruz area throughout this time. So my book is a collection of stories of these people, stories of survival, resilience, heroic reactions to overwhelming circumstances and loss. And I want to begin by contextualizing a little bit of this loss for people. These are some numbers that I put together for my friend Caroline Ward, who is a Tataviam woman who had, back in 2015, in order to pay homage to Native California ancestors and to protest the canonization of Junipero Serra, she and her son walked from mission to mission across the states. And she asked me to, while she was doing that, to do research and to look into baptismal and burial numbers at each of the missions. And you can see here, what we see here is a very disturbing story of devastating loss. I've highlighted the Santa Cruz San Juan Bautista missions, and I know Val has often, and other Amah Mutsun people have talked about how Santa Cruz in particular is notorious for being a place with very abusive padres. And these numbers really bear that out. You can see that what this is showing here, the percentage of people who have been buried by the time the missions closed in 1839. Mission Santa Cruz, it was 90%, over 90% of the people who have been baptized there who died at the mission. And San Juan Bautista is very close, over 85%. And you can see this pattern across all the missions. And I think it's really important to have that context, because even though we might talk about stories of how people resisted and how people found ways to survive, it has to be understood within this larger context of devastating loss. But today, what I'm going to talk about today is actually I'm going to talk about the title of my book, which is "We Are Not Animals." And this is taken from the oral histories. Rob also mentioned fellow Lorenzo Asisara, who was from Mission Santa Cruz, and he gave some interviews in the 1870s where he told really important stories of oral histories of what had happened there taking place. One of the things he talked about a lot was the assassination of the cruel and abusive Padre Quintana. And Quintana was a padre who had a whip specially fashioned with metal so that it would inflict more pain on people and punish them. And he had recently beaten 2 young men nearly to death. And so in response to this, according to Asisara, 20 men and women, Native men and women, gathered together to discuss their options. The quote that he provides here is actually from Asisara, attributes it to a young man named Lino, who was 18 years old at the time. He was the oldest child born in the mission. He was Quintana's personal assistant, and he was central in the assassination and coming up with this. And this is what Lino explains. This is translated, of course, from the Spanish that Asisara provided. But I'll read through it here to get a sense. But Lino says, the first thing we need to do is to keep the padre from having the desire to punish people in such a manner, for we are not animals. He tells us in his sermon that God does not command this type of punishment in his example or doctrine. Tell me then, what are we to do with the padre? Run him off? We cannot do, nor can we take him before a judge, since we do not know who commands him to do what he does to us. It will be better if we kill the padre without anyone knowing about it, not even the pages or anyone else, only those that are here present. So in this story, Lino recognizes that Quintana has overstepped his boundaries and has failed to follow in his own teachings. And Lino also grasps and realizes that the mission system does not allow for them to take it to a judge, that there is no appeal process for them. There is no built-in protection for Indigenous people within the missions. So they're left with the only option, which is to challenge his abuses directly. But what I want to analyze here for our purposes is the implications of this phrase that he uses. He says, we are not animals. And I think that there's a lot, I chose this to be the title of the book for a lot of reasons, but I think that there's a lot of depth and a lot of really interesting stuff that comes out of this. So I want to look at what does he mean by this? And in order to do that, I want to look a little bit about what did animals mean? What was the significance of animals for Indigenous peoples at that time? And what did they mean for the Spanish? And then we can kind of do a comparison and think about what can we learn from Lino's phrase of this? What does it tell us about not only Lino and the Indigenous people at the time there, but about their history and the implications of this? Okay, so when we talk about, let's see, go to the next slide here. Okay, and a quick word on this. This is a map that I had made for the book. This is really built on the work of Ed Ketchum, the Amah Mutsun Tribal historian. And so I worked with him to try to come up with better maps. And Renya and Judy, everyone, I have better maps for you that I can share from the dissertation ones, much more improved ones that I put together. But this is one that really focuses on the what's called Popule Ochum, which is what the Amah Mutsun understand the greater territory to be. These numbers are all village sites that we've listed on the side here. So coming back to what do animals mean for Indigenous peoples in their world at the time here? Well, the Indigenous world before Spanish got here and after is based on relationships and interrelationships. So a lot of, I show this map here because a lot of the place names are built around animals. So for example, you see a lot of native villages have a similar syntax. They're set up, they use the suffix tak or taka. You see this all over your stock, tiyuv tak. And tak as a suffix means the place of or the home of. But a lot of these places, I'll give you some examples. Santa Cruz was known as Aulintak, which the translation of that means the place of the red abalone. In Watsonville, there's a village site that's known as Tiyuvta, which means the place of the elk. And there are Tule elk there in abundance. There's a bunch of other ones. I'll give just a couple examples. Ipitak is the place of the rattlesnake. There's Orestak, which is the place of bear. So I think that this shows us a couple things, but for one thing, animals were often associated with a particular region, with a particular village. So animals were in relationship to Native peoples in multiple ways, but one of them is reflected in the prominence there. As a kind of a quick note on the irony, when the Portola expedition came through Watsonville area, they actually passed through a village of Tiufta, which is the elk place. And they describe seeing a bunch of Tule elk, which they describe a little differently. So it's kind of interesting because they are unable to understand the layout of the land and what is really happening, but yet they're still seeing the actual animals of the place, which I think is kind of fascinating. Furthermore, Indigenous peoples had spiritual connections with animals. So animals visited Native people in their dreams. They brought them messages and knowledge and insights into their world, things that they could learn from. And then on top of that, animals also, there was relationships with animals such as deer and bear that anthropologists refer to as moieties. But there were ways that different families had ties, kinship ties to certain animals that then tied into rituals of social cohesion. So for example, when somebody died in Native society, people from the other, from a different clan would then be responsible for burying them. So it was a way that tied people together. So some people would be associated with this animal, others with another, and it was a way that kind of kept people together. So I want to point out, that overall it was a world of interrelations and interconnections, and animals were an intimate part of this, an important part of this. So what does it mean when he has this quote? One other note on this, Solorzano, which Rob mentioned going through the notes, but she has stories in there too, where even by 1930, she's pondering and she's inquisitive about the religion of cattle or of cows, right? So there is this deep, much deeper kind of inquisitiveness or understanding about the animals and their relationship. So to understand what Lino is saying when he says this, I want to talk a little bit about Spanish relationships with animals. So when the Spanish colonizers arrived up into this area in California, they brought with them their own crops, right? They immediately started to kind of upend all of the native grasses and grasslands that were there, plant their own foods and crops and stuff like this. And let me make the point that it's not them who's doing the work. They put Native people to work doing this. So they brought with them the crops, but of course, Native people did all of the labor at the missions. Along with the foods and different stuff that they brought along, they also brought with them their own animals. So things like pigs and cattle and horses and chicken, right? They brought with them livestock. And again, they put Native people to work with doing all of the driving, all the animal care, right? That came with this. Well, along with the animals, they also brought their instruments to control the animals, because for Spanish, the relationship to the animals that they brought with them was all about control. It was about dominance, right? These were animals that they kept in a certain area. They penned them in. They also had things like yokes to control them. You can see some of these images here. They had whips that they used to drive them, right? And different kind of cattle prods that they did. And of course, they put Native people to work controlling them, right? They were put in charge of keeping the animals, right? Butchering the animals, feeding the, using them as food or turning them into shoes or leather and products like this. So I think that this is key. And this is what I want to get to here, is that for Native people, the relationship to animals, they experience a change, a shift from their own traditional ways of relating to the world around them and to animals into what was imposed by the Spanish at this point, right? In this kind of system of control. And so when, and this is a quote from before from Solorzano. This is the one quote I had kind of put this here, I guess. But you can see here, so this is in 1930, but Solorzano is talking about it, right? She's thinking about the significance of the cord. And at the end, she says, it's a curious thing that the cows will eat their afterbirth. It must be their religion, right? I think it really shows this curiosity and kind of a different level of interrogation, right? Of trying to understand animals rather than just as pack mules and as something to control. So So what does this tell us about this? I mean, these are images here of kind of the control. So what you can see is that there's a similarity between the way that the Spanish viewed animals and the way that they were treated with the way that Native peoples were also treating them. And it connects with a larger discussion and academic debate about the mission. So there's a conversation that goes on nowadays where people are trying to interrogate, what were the missions? We know that they're not these idyllic, benign spaces that they've been portrayed as for so many years. But some people debate, are they a system like a penal system, like a prison system? Are they concentration camps? How can we view them? And I'm sympathetic to those arguments because I think when you look at the devastating loss and the numbers that I showed you at the very beginning, the end result isn't that different from, say, the concentration camps or certainly worse than even the prison system. So I understand where people are coming from in these arguments. But I think when you really get into it and look at what is going on at the missions, I would propose that there's a little different way that we can look at this. So that if we really want to understand the missions and the relationship of the missions, the key to this is really in Lino's statement and in understanding how Lino is articulating his own experience of the missions there. And it has to do with being treated as livestock. So I think for Native people, they see very much that they are basically being treated in the same way. And it's a system that is dehumanizing at its core. And I think that's one of the big takeaways here. So there's a disconnect between how the Padres articulated their goals and their aims with Native people, right? They articulate it as being part of a spiritual conquest where their intention is to convert them to Catholicism. And this is what the Padres are saying at the time, that they're supposed to be recognizing a humanity that will bring this. But the reality of their treatment within the missions doesn't tell that same story. In fact, the reality of the way that they treated people was a very dehumanizing thing. They brought Native people in who had a very sophisticated culture and society that was happening there. And they instructed them as if they in a very patronizing way where they assumed that they had no culture, they assumed that they had no knowledge, no histories, no teachings, and then they punished them for whenever they did not correspond to Catholicism, to Spanish Franciscan society. So it was a process of dehumanizing them and treating them as less than human. It was labor camps. They put them to work, as I mentioned before. I mean, we have to understand the missions were the central labor force that provided everything for Spanish colonizers. So for the pueblos, for the people in places like San Jose, at the Villa de Branciforte, right across from Santa Cruz, Native people were called on to build their buildings. They made the products that they used, the food that they ate, everything that they did. So Native people were very much used as animals in this way, as livestock was. They were the producers of products. Another aspect of this, I won't have time to get into the full story, but there are stories, the death rates were so abysmal at these missions. And so one of the fixations, the obsessions of the Padres was on reproduction and on them having children, because they wanted to keep the numbers up. They wanted to keep their workers, going and to keep a large number there. And so in the oral histories of Asesara, for example, there's a story of a couple who are unable to conceive of a child. And so the reaction of the Padre is to, it basically, when you read through it, it's horrific because it's very dehumanizing. He basically has them have sex in front of him. He checks their bodies to see if they're functioning. But if you think of it in terms of animal husbandry, I think that's the only frame that you can understand it, because, and again, it just reinforces this thing. They did not see Native people as human. They saw them as basically animals. Anyway, it's a kind of a horrific thing to ponder. So it's a tough thing to cover in a very quick way like this. But I think consistently you can see it across the board that is basically how they are viewed. So Native people, to close, let me bring it back to here because I want to leave time for question and answers. But Native people lived in a very sophisticated, complicated society that was based on relationships and interrelationships. By the way, it's another map. This is a much more updated one. Renya, we should talk because I can share you this one with you. which is much improved off the other one. But the indigenous society that was here before the Spanish got here was a very complicated one, built on relationships and interrelationships between kinship ties, between different tribes and different families, but also between animals and the world around them, right? It was living in relationship. So what did Lino really mean when he says, we are not animals? I think that the real interpretation of that is that he's specifically talking about the way that Spanish are treating animals. He's talking about the beatings and the whippings. These are not indigenous practices. That's not how indigenous people related to animals or related to the world, but it's how the Spanish taught them to treat these animals that are brought up there. So ultimately, when Lino asserts we are not animals, it's a rejection of the treatment that he's receiving and that other Native people and his family members are receiving there. It's a rejection of being treated in this dehumanizing way in which the Spanish are treating the animals as well. And so it's ultimately a rejection of this colonial system, which is a dehumanizing system. Okay, I'm gonna end it there. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to answer any questions people might have.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Rizzo, for such a fascinating talk that you just shared with us. We'll now start the Q&A session. And just as a reminder, for anyone here, you can submit questions to the co-host labeled Ask Your Questions Here. And the first question, Julie will ask.
So as a non-native scholar, how has working so closely with the Amah Mutsun changed your perspectives on being a historian?
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, I think that, I wouldn't have been able to do the work that I did. I wouldn't have been able to write this book at all without the feedback and the help, building a relationship with Val, with Ed. So I guess the best way to answer that is that when I finished my dissertation, I sent a copy to Val and to Ed and to others. But Ed in particular went through and page by page offered all sorts of critiques and feedback and a really amazing wealth of thoughts on it that he shared with me. I learned a lot from it. So I think, time and time again, he would offer his interpretation of historical events or things and the ways, his perspective on it. And so it really helped me to gain a better respect for, how, the indigenous worldview, his worldview, and of course is related to Ascension Solorzano. And so the type of knowledge that he had. So yeah, so it has been instrumental. I think, I think that people, unfortunately, it comes up a lot where people look at scholars and historians and, as the final words. And I think that people need to start thinking that differently. I think that, people need to recognize the knowledge that's still held within Native communities like the Amah Mutsun. Knowledge and scholarship needs to come the other direction, right? So I think that scholars would do a lot better to listen to Native people today and to their understandings of things and learn from that, and then interpret the documents and the histories from that angle. And so I think that's kind of the thing that I've learned the most, is that we have to, come from the angle of the oral histories, start at that point to read things and understand things instead of the other way around, which unfortunately is how too often scholarship has been.
Great, thank you. We have a sort of a logistical question for you, and it is, who is the publisher of your book? Is it out yet? If not, when will it come out?
Oh, thank you. That's very sweet. So my book is coming out. It will be in print in the fall of next fall, 2021. That was an odd way to say that, but yeah, it'll come out in the fall of 2021. It's going to be published with University of Nebraska Press, who've been really wonderful to work with. They've been great. So it's still on its way. Val wrote a really wonderful foreword to the book. That's really beautifully written and really nice. So I'm very honored to have that as part of that.
We'll be looking forward to that. So can you explain why the missions have no markers at the burials for Indians in their cemeteries?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Every mission is a little bit different. I know in some, I want to say San Juan Capistrano, they have like a marker, a tiny little thing. And my sister's a teacher down there, and I remember her saying that when her students had gone there, they said, "Wait, how can all the Native people be buried there?" Which of course is, just confounding. But I can speak to Santa Cruz, and Santa Cruz, I mean, it's a particularly unique story, but the actual mission, Santa Cruz is the only mission that the original mission adobe is no longer standing. It fell in an earthquake in the 1850s. The citizens here in Santa Cruz rebuilt this Victorian church that's now Holy Cross, that stands where the mission site was in the 1870s. When they did that, they actually unearthed thousands of burials, and they put them into wheelbarrows, and they brought them across town, and they dumped them basically into a large site that remained unmarked up until, I want to say, maybe 2016 or 17. And they had a little tag on there that says, Native people here, buried here, or something that was really didn't show much at all. And then finally they did put a monument there, and there was a ceremony by the Amah Mutsun to kind of pay respects to the people buried there. But I would say, to answer the question though, why it isn't shown there, it's probably wrapped into the whole mythology around the missions. The missions are very misrepresented as a whole, and they're turned into these kind of idyllic spaces, typically to tell a romanticized story that was put forth by the Franciscan historians 100 years ago, who were trying to tell this very romanticized story to boost tourism to California. So I think it's tied into that. I think that in pretty much every facet, Native histories and stories have been erased at the mission sites. I will say, as a final note on that, I'm working with State Parks right now, and State Parks does own the Mission Santa Cruz State Historic Park, which is the adobe there was the old Native housing. And so we're working right now to work closely with Val, with Amah Mutsun to, I want to redo the historical exhibits there. I know they have worked with them, but there's a long way to go to improve the telling of those stories. And so that's something we want to do. And it starts with listening to Val and to others about hearing what's important to be represented there in these histories. So I do have hope that that can shift, starting with Mission Santa Cruz adobe, but it's got a long way to go to really be telling the truth about these histories.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and we hope that shift can happen as well. We have time for one last question, and it's, in your position as a historian for the Parks of Santa Cruz County, how are you working to integrate your work's findings into the knowledge base of the county and perhaps the state more broadly? And the submitter says, also, thank you for your important work.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. I also see somebody asked, what was the name of the book? The book is We Are Not Animals. Anyway, to answer that. Yeah, so that's a great question. I think I want to point out there's some interesting things that the governor Newsom recently declared. There's an executive order that came out in late September where he was calling for governmental entities to review ancestral lands and consider co-management or even returning lands to Native tribes. I think is a really important proclamation, although unless things actually move forward and this happen, then it just becomes more words. So it is my hope that governmental bodies, and that includes the cities and states, but it also includes state parks, take that very seriously and start to consider those sites. And I think the mission sites, a prime example of that, the missions, of course, were built by Native people. I mean, the adobes themselves are built by the hands of Native ancestors. And so they're important sites, I would say, for those reasons, right? These monuments built by them, not about the Franciscan inhabitants who were there, but the Native laborers who were there. So, my hope is that we can, this is all, I guess, hopes and anticipation. I hope that we can, shift the stories that are told at Mission Santa Cruz. State parks do hold 2 other missions one up in Sonoma, and then one at La Purísima. So it's my hope that that can be a kind of the beginning of retelling the stories at the other state parks. Most of the missions are held by the Catholic Church, which we don't have any control over. But I think my hope is that we can start some momentum of telling the truth of these stories, and again, principally by working in collaboration with the tribes whose histories these missions stand for, and whose histories were at these missions. I think that that's really the main thing, is we need to start working with tribal people like the Amah Mutsun to make sure that their stories are told in that. And there's some specific ideas, but we'll have to see how those all develop. But I think that's kind of the main overall point to make there. And thank you so much. It's really been an honor to be here. I've really enjoyed all of the talks today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rizzo. Again, to the audience, if you would like to reach out to any of the scholars who presented today, we have their email information on the screen. And we'll now conclude this event with final words from the AIRC Director, Dr. Rebecca Hernandez, and our Program Coordinator, Jemsy Ortiz. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Rebecca Hernandez. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Mescalero in Warm Springs, Apache. Today, we just want to say again how very grateful we are for taking the time to be with us today. And I just again extend a thank you to all of our speakers who shared such important information with us. But along with them, I want to take a moment to extend a special thanks to the entire AIRC team. All of our events are student organized, and that includes this one. I'm sure you'd agree that they all did an outstanding job. I want to just name them all: Christopher Lang, Amanda Collins, Sarah Zamariuli, Azraeli Bedola, Julia Gavin, Tawny Henningsen, Aurelie Hernandez, Kamiko Hostler, Andrea Lopez, Valeria Mena, and Josie Villagrana Puentes. Many things were taking place today behind the scenes, and we could not have hosted this event without our in-house Zoom expert, Jemsy Ortiz, who's our program coordinator. We just have such an outstanding team. So next, I want to just bring your attention to our upcoming event, Indigithanks, which is our annual event. And it's an annual event, kind of an alternative perspective on Thanksgiving. So we'd love to see you there. You can find out more information on our website. And yeah, we will feature, our guest speaker will be Chef Crystal Wapepa on November 20. So again, Jemsy, you want to say close up for us?
Yeah, so thank you all for attending this very special event, our first virtual Amah Mutsun Speaker Series. This event was recorded, and we will be uploading it to the AIRC YouTube channel later next week. We will send an email to everyone who registered with an event evaluation form. The link to that evaluation will also be shared in the chat. We would really appreciate your feedback so we can continue to improve our events. Thank you all so much, interns, speakers, and Chairman Lopez. See you soon and take care. Thank you, everybody.